Between worlds, approaching strategies to integrate urban fragments. We start with the simple word fragment, an irregular piece or a broken line, a disconnection between urban spaces, between realities and experiences of a city like Guadalajara. The cultural importance of the city lies in being one of the metropolises with one of the richest cultural movements in America, with a vast agenda that exploits the attributes of the city, being the center and headquarters of international artistic encounters and renowned audiovisual exhibitions. On the other hand, Huentitan, which is the non-urban area, is the natural heritage of the municipality, with its ravine, flora, and fauna. Architecturally, the importance is in its more than 2,000 colonies that reflect the European style of the 19th century, with its colonial renown and the modernization that the technology and trends of the 21st century have brought. It is worth highlighting Guadalajara's rich biodiversity and culture, the development it has in the recent years. Guadalajara's urban growth started within the settlement around the streams and further it adapted to the Spanish colonial grid. After understanding how the city developed, we could conclude that the last 20-year settlement expansion had taken place towards La Barranca and its surroundings. Throughout the complex hydrological system, the placed and following paths of Huentitan May River, one of the settlements that we know today as Huentitan and Zapopan, was developed. Within the site, we can observe a classification of settlements differentiating those formal from the self-built ones. The latter are considered with this nomenclature due to the spontaneity of their conception, their lack of services, and the precarious public infrastructure such as paving of the streets and public lighting. Even though the barranca is known as the most relevant topographical accident of the place, it was also possible to identify a sequence of topographic variations through the Zapopan sector that characterize the place. Another important characteristic is the presence of streams associated mostly with the self-built settlements, generating big stones and at the same time communication barriers. In addition to those that have a constant water flow, there are also dry streams, where in certain sectors they are used as communication routes, but then they are exposed to possible floods and landslides in periods of rain. We contribute to this analysis with the main roads and how they cross the sector. And additionally, the main metropolitan green spaces are identified, such as the zoo and the Centinela forest. Lastly, analyzing the actual urban grid, we figured out that it doesn't correspond in its entirety to the conformation of the colonies. So it was possible to identify a coincidence which includes the ruptures within the grid and the limits within the colony and one colony and another. The ruptures have become barriers within the community, creating boundaries and isolating the different colonies because of the lack of connection. So for us, these empty lands are considered as potential areas for networking of connections that bring the barranca into the urban grid and integrate the different elements that conform the city. A reading of the metropolitan scale allows us to select testing areas that can help us to enhance the replicability of strategies and obtain the integration between the urban fragments, mostly the colonies and programmed and self-constructed settlements. Specifically, in Zapopan, we selected testing areas in which the present dry creeks, abrupt topography, and infrastructure that act as boundaries between two sides of the city. Within the sector, we identify the following housing topology and block conformation, predominating the distribution with backyards and separation by dividing walls. In order to achieve this proposal, there must be a developed connection system, including transportation routes, corridors between urban green spaces, and creeks rehabilitation, trying to keep a holistic view within the urban grid and the rupture integration for further replicability. The green armatures analysis allows us to identify the main intervention areas. For areas that appeared to be more consolidated, central transformation fields were proposed to improve the quality of the settlements and boost the economy and tourism of the region. On the other side, receptive fields were proposed in less consolidated areas, including actual empty lots to allow the new settlements to come in. These fields were all integrated by a network of corridors that are meant to attract activities into the area. Once the study areas have been defined, it is sought to take advantage of the natural character of both sectors and use it to generate new connections, to integrate the green of the canyon to the rest of the city. The first intervention sector is characterized mainly by the presence of topography and former creeks that are currently dry and tend to fill up within the rainy periods, turning these lands into possible risk zones for self-constructed settlements. To study the urban growth of the site, in which we can appreciate that since 2005, self-constructed settlements have started to appropriate the empty space, despite the rough terrain and the presence of vegetation. To comprehend better the extension of this route, we proceeded with a series of analyses where we could identify the limits of this fracture. The vehicle roads surrounding the site, and the pedestrian paths that were made spontaneously by the locals over the years. It's because of this analysis that we've noted that there is an intention to connect both sides of the canyon. However, the paths that currently exist do not allow such connections. Because of this, we categorize the green areas into green protected areas inside the rupture and semi-occupied areas. And at the same time, realize that there was a greater presence of vegetation on the south side of the canyon. Finally, we've identified the main existing connections and thus noticed that some of these roads branch into the ruptures, penetrating the boundaries between the city and the protected green area. In this sense, we can also appreciate that the growth of these settlements stops abruptly in some areas, but in others, it slowly emerges into the canyon. This way, defining soft limits and hard limits, leading us to identify a sectorization that qualifies the unused space and thus the urban relations. This way, the proposal is structured on the definition of green areas, which seek to become a mechanism through which protected areas can be created, allowing creeks and land to be rehabilitated. This way consolidates a new urban park that allows the connections between the colonies and its surroundings through different types of connectivity systems, which allow it to integrate the park within its limits as well as with the rest of the city. Through green and mobility corridors, the proposal seeks to integrate the vegetation and the nature to the rest of the urban grid, taking advantage of the empty lots to generate a new housing typology that defines and serves this main corridor. This way, creating new mobility strategies, integrating bike lanes and public transportation systems to the existing urban mobility. However, the proposal seeks to integrate the existing housing typology by establishing an order that allows the creation of new self-constructed housing in the site, focusing on the integration of the urban grid with the limits of the rupture and the creation of new urban facilities that can promote the social and cultural integration. More defined limits are taken as an advantage to create the integrated scale zones between the homes and the new metropolitan park, which allowed the community to enjoy spaces that are most friendly to the family environment and to the everyday life. Then, in the less dense limits, there is the opportunity to establish new urban facilities of an economic and cultural nature that, in addition to serving the community and serving for its integration, they become a transition between the metropolitan park and the urban grid. One of the main objectives is to generate new forms of connection, which is why a system of bridges and stairs will be created to connect both sides of the canyon where people already were seeking to travel. Likewise, these elements are not only provided as connectors, but also as urban facilities that provide service within the park for the community. Sloping land is proposed as agricultural terraces to boost local production and reduce the growth of the settlements in a non-controlled way. By including public spaces and urban facilities for the community, consolidating a transitional space between the existing housing and the canyon area. In search of more effective connections, a structure that generates faster connectivity is proposed, prepared with equipment, formalizing a more dynamic route that alternates with terrace routes and slopes. Finally, the typologies used for the conformation of this new urban park that seek to integrate the fragmented spaces within the city are shown, redefining the interstitial spaces and thus generating a new centrality.
The second intervention sector, we named it the Zapopan Lineal Park. It is characterized by the presence of the aqueduct, a creek, empty lots, a neighborhood center church, decennial sport field, and the limits within the border of the barranca. We proceeded with the sector analysis, starting with its limits regarding the aqueduct and the empty spaces. Then looked after the road system and the current transversal connections. And also located the pedestrian ones, observing that there are some existing pedestrian passages that crosses east-west direction. Further, both were overlapped, and then watch how the current green areas surrounding the infrastructure that divides both sides of the sector is directly related to a creek. Also, it is important to analyze the ruptures within the limits, characterized mostly as empty lots with subused features, some near the stream and others bordering the aqueduct, and the border types so we could identify which were soft for further intervention and which were hard. An approximate sectorization with new housing typology, productive terraces, and recreational terraces were proposed. Also, there is proposed urban facilities as a sport and ecological park, a cultural node. For housing typology, we proposed a productive housing node, and at the sector limits, a series of housing reformations according to the sectors already shown. For the above earth aqueduct structures, an outside structure which will contain ramps and the urban stairs, creating new paths toward a city viewpoint. And for the path in which the aqueduct stays underground and is surrounded by walls, we propose a whole new corridor that integrates its east-west dynamics within the sectors. This connection will be done every 450 meters. For in-between spaces, there will be high pedestrian walkways. Both of them will be aligned to the vehicle road systems. Then create an ecological park which will contain a tree-dense area, children recreative zone associated with an existing kindergarten, and a humid park regarding the creek. Mixed-use housing is proposed. They will have a community productive area to create attraction zones for the new development. And a commercial border will be proposed as a transition boundary between the lineal aqueduct park and the existing urban occupation. There will be created crossroads, connections that go towards newly created pocket parks for a community scale use, which will provide the community new social and cultural dynamics. Creating new public spaces for the city and enhancing the green spaces integration might create a great change within the place. And finally, the sport cultural node will consist in a covered sports center, open air courts, an auditorium, workshop space, and public square. Public neighborhood space, a neighborhood market, and a craft market, creating a sequence of spaces that blends both sides into one. Public spaces, green corridors, new mobility systems, and cultural recreational activities are given to the community for the improvement and social being. Within the proposed strategies for these two sectors, we arrive at the conclusion that they can be replicated in other Raptor sectors that match each analyzed conditions, creating a new connectivity system that revolve around new centralities in the site. Finally, the proposal seeks to integrate the fragmented spaces within the city, defining two base study sectors to later generate typologies that can be repeated under different conditions, taking the fragments as an opportunity instead of hiding the breakages and repairs. They claim themselves as an inherent part of each sector that only beautifies it and testifies to its capacity to transformation. The Raptors are part of the city. They make it unique and define its identity.